Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. My name is Mike Hernandez. I'm from El Salvador, and as Bonnie said, I'm a community of practice youth advisor. I'm very happy to share with you three important facts about myself. I love swimming, I love photography, and I'm from El Salvador. El Salvador is a very small country in the Central America area. So I'm just in the middle between North and South America. I'm more than happy to be here, and I hope you learn a lot from this presentation and webinar. Thank you, Bonnie.
Thanks, Mike. And I'm Bonnie Politz. My little logo's underneath there. Obviously, I love yoga. I try and keep myself going with that. I'm an avid reader, and I live in Washington, D.C. I'm a native Washingtonian. Been in and out of the city several times, but this is definitely home base from when I was born. So it's a beautiful place and always has a lot going on, as we know. Okay, so we can move on to the next slide. So we just wanted to tell you what the agenda was for today, to the introductions. We're going to do a little overview of what happened last year with the COP, some results of a survey that we did with info from people who submitted their responses. We're very happy to have Claire Ignatowski, who's going to be doing an overview of the state of measuring youth systems change. We'll have time for some discussion and then what's coming up next. So the Youth System Strengthening Community of Practice is about really providing a space where we can talk about the purposes, the processes, the outcomes, about what it takes to really reform systems. We're not talking about individual programs that are doing wonderful things, and that are actually making changes at the program level or even at the practice level. It's a level up from there that we're really thinking, what is going to be the sustainable, systemic changes that are going to impact not 1,000 young people or even 10,000 young people, but millions of young people across a country or in a certain level of government functioning. Could be a government, could be some kind of state, but that there has been systemic change that's going to be able to go on. And this is a framework that we've been using from the Youth Systems Collaborative, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second, that last year when we did all the presentations, people did their presentations and took parts of this framework to tell their story, whether it was about how they actually did change norm and mindsets and how that's now being used in that country to reframe what gets measured, what gets spoken about, what policymakers are using, what legislators are using. So that's just one example. And there is a discussion group link that's there and boxed about how to get connected into the community of practice. We go on to the next slide. So the Youth Systems Collaborative really began, Claire and I were sort of the instigators of this actually in 2018. And we're really focused with a community of practice that includes these international organizations that typically are in competition with each other for going after certain proposals and grants and contracts. But over the past 4 years, we have created a table where we're coming together as colleagues to really think about field building around systems change for young people globally. And it's been an incredibly wonderful experience to have folks from these organizations stay at the table, continue to learn from each other, and use and create the framework, which Claire did a few years ago with support from RTI, to actually have something that we can use to learn from. So we'll go on to the next slide. So last year, our throwback, we did several webinars last year. You can get links to the recordings, but we did look at lessons from several different countries around systems change that's happening at the national level. And then our last call in October was with donors from the Aspen Institute, the Annie Casey Foundation, and USAID, talking about why they support systems change for youth, where they see it going, where they see the challenges and the opportunities. So that's available for you to see. Okay, on to the next. Mike?
Okay, so at the beginning of this year, we sent a survey to all our COP members. We wanted to know, we wanted to ask, and we wanted to reflect upon our practices during last year and for what it is coming for this year. So 4 of our takeaways from the survey, we had 10 respondents. I hope that for the future we get more respondents. But number 1 is the YSS COP joint recommendation. Number 2 is the visual networking. Number 3 is speakers engagement, and 4 topics for future YSS COP events. All these takeaways just make us reflect upon our practices, and we want to make more engagement between members and our COP champions, the youth advisors, and all participants from YSS. So if you go to the next slide, Stephanie, some of the topics that were suggested for the next events are ways to better coordinate and collaborate our work in partnership with all the other global youth system groups and alliances, good practices with specific how-tos, including timelines and resources for system strengthening, youth engagement in systems change work, focusing research or evidence around best practices in working with youth enabling environment for system change, teachers, private sector, government, etc. More system strengthening success stories, specifically meaningfully involving youth to influence system change. Measuring system change, for example, the BEAM exchange is still a similar event for market system development. These comments were taken from the survey that we sent at the beginning of the year, and we are starting right now with measuring systems change. So it's a pleasure for us to get these comments, to get suggestions. We want to make this community stronger, and we want to go further. We want to move on to next steps. We want to move through meaningful conversations. We want to move from meaningful webinars, and we are taking into consideration what you suggested and commented. Next, please. Okay.
So, yeah, so I am so happy always to introduce my friend and colleague, Claire Gnatowski. And let me just say, the name of this event today, this webinar, is the state of measuring youth systems change. And we just want to make sure there are no easy answers to this. It's not like there are thousands and thousands of examples that we have to show. This is sort of a beginning of a discussion. And we thought actually that this first webinar would be focused on this, and possibly the last webinar, so that we could actually use the ones in between and come back with some more related to this, and with maybe some more of you involved actually presenting, who are part of the community of practice. And to just reflect back on the youth systems collaborative framework that we showed earlier, and to remember that measuring is more than just about numbers of young people who are engaged. We're looking at changes in norms and mindsets, in resource flows, in policy, in capacity development, in systems mapping, vision and goals, data, learning and evaluation. So there isn't the systemic change in any of those areas can lead up to the big changes we want to see. So we've, when Claire is speaking and giving us sort of this overview, is to remember there's no one way of thinking about this. And we have to put together a lot of puzzle pieces to really get to the impacts of significant systems change that we want to see in countries. So the next slide, please. So Claire, there she is. And I have learned so much from traveling, doing workshops together with her, doing trainings together with her. We have this common interest in really thinking about systems, and as that puts us, advocating for the well-being of our next generation. So Claire is an expert in so many ways. She has worked at USAID, which is where I met her, and done a lot of work around youth workforce development and education. Lots of incredible experience in research and evaluation, project design, policy development. And during her work at USAID as a senior advisor, she worked in over 22 developing countries. And I think part of that experience of being in countries, spending time, getting to really talk to people at different levels, from the public sector, the private sector, communities, young people who are engaged in all of the systems that impact them. She's just a great person to begin to kick off this discussion with us. So Claire, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bonnie. And thank you, Mike. And I think a little congratulations is in order. There was a full year of the youth systems strengthening community of practice, and I'm really happy that we making sense, and the whole team decided to move forward with continuing the conversation for another year. So that's a great thing. I think it's an important time to be dialoguing. One of our key funding partners, USAID, is very much thinking about youth systems. So delighted to be here to share an assessment that I was involved in wearing my other hat. So as Bonnie mentioned, I do work with Creative Associates as their youth and systems thinking advisor, but I also work as an independent consultant. And so I was involved in an assessment of a global assessment of the status of positive youth development that was conducted by the university research company with funding from USAID. It was a cooperative agreement. And it came out in November 2020. And then we began to share it in about last year, but things being as they are, this study is, there's still so much to mine from it. And so what I'll do today is pull out the systems change, the systems deep dive in the assessment and share that with you. But just a little further background, the other partners that were involved in the assessment were the University of California, San Francisco, the City University of New York, and then a university in Indonesia and a university in Kenya. Bonnie, I see your hand up. Should I?
Sorry, I just wanted to remind people to please, if you, as Claire goes through this, if you have any questions, if you have something you want to add, please put it in the chat and we're going to get to it in the discussion section. I know that was put into the chat, but I just wanted to say it out loud. Thanks.
Sure, I'd be happy to hear questions. In terms of the study, the link is, the link will be shared for accessing the assessment. Noting too that Samantha Ski was the project director at URC, and Olga Merchant was the project director from USAID. And it was, just to give you a little bit of background of what you're looking at here, we conducted a global survey with 600 respondents. The majority of the respondents were from implementing partners of youth programming, including global and local or based in low and middle income countries. But 20% of the respondents were youth themselves and USAID, and then a smaller group from governments and other donors. So we asked them, what is most needed to improve country-based support of positive youth development? And this question of coordinating across diverse partners for stronger youth systems came up as the #1 area that is most needed. And secondly, capacity building of youth service providers. And then in terms of financing and policy reform, a little bit less urgent, but still there. So let's move on to the next slide. So another part of the assessment involved doing a document review of recent, of really all of the USAID procurements through the YouthPower mechanism. So this was a substantial amount of youth programming. And the purpose for doing the review is to get a picture of where USAID is in thinking about systems in its youth programming. And so I just wanted to share with you the matrix or the rubric that we use for that review, because I think it's an important way to begin thinking about how to measure systems change. And so you can't see it all here. We have a link that we'll share to the matrix itself. It's sort of in the background. I've pulled out a few of them a few of the categories. So, you know, understanding the existing systems dynamics, bringing together local stakeholders to better own a problem and share a vision for a better future, and begin to develop and commit to coordinating solutions is the second category. Improves and coordinated service delivery. I'm just reading some of them to you now. Shared standards and indicators and monitoring and evaluation among the actors. Then the fifth one is around building capacity and commitment and productive relationships among the local actors. And then the sixth one was really around USAID, and we can extend that to international partners, which is that their role is flexible, adaptive, facilitative, and supportive, you know, and that there's an understanding of the need for a longer time horizon than, you know, we typically see in short-term projects. The seventh area was around looking at donor coordination, and then policy reform. The ninth is around normative change and shifting mental models, and then finally really building on local resources. So I'll go, these themes will come back around when I share the findings and the recommendations. Let's see, we can go to the next slide. So in terms of the findings of this document review, and they were really corroborated by the key informant interviews, that there sometimes was an overemphasis on measuring the outcomes as opposed to building the country systems. Of course, these two things are linked, but sort of having a weak or not as robust lexicon or way of talking about systems work was part of that, those findings. There in these, you know, procurements, there was mention and focus on capacity building of institutions for better youth service. However, often the capacity building was lacking a strategic focus. It was just sort of do capacity building, but not in a strategic way. There was not as much, there was not a focus or a mention of developing or leveraging local investments. There was the idea of shared, I want to put the emphasis on this piece of shared standards, and monitoring and evaluation were rarely the focus of attention. Programs have lots of monitoring and evaluation, as we know, but there's rarely a focus on how we all talk together about our standards and indicators for systems change. Policy, again, was relatively rare, and this need for talking about directly the changing roles of implementing partners. There were, in terms of normative change and shifts in mindsets, there were a number of areas where this was a focus. For example, public health approach to violence prevention was seen in the procurements, and as well as a changing attitudes towards technical and vocational training within the education system, moving from a negative view of that to a more positive response to labor market demand. That was a critical mindset shift for youth work. So let's go to the recommendations. These are the recommendations that we made primarily to USAID, but they are, I think, relevant to all of us. They affect, no matter where we are in the system, they affect us. So really encouraging, looking for existing efforts around systems change. that may be already initiated and already owned, and identifying them and lifting them up and supporting them, as opposed to constantly starting a new project, so there is a lot happening, and so really finding those initiatives and lifting them up. In terms of the second one is really about improving our language and our knowledge about systems, terminology, and analytics, that we can better understand systems dynamics. So the better we get about talking about where systems are breaking down, what the gaps are, what are the incentives and disincentives for what we want to see, and those kinds of unintended consequences. This is sort of systems terminology that I think we can more productively bring to our work. We really, a sort of low-hanging fruit is this notion of the backbone organization or intermediary, that really their role in bringing together diverse stakeholders in a facilitative approach, that is a really critical function, and one that we can focus on. This exploring the use of more shared monitoring and evaluation platforms or dashboards is more, technology just keeps going, right? And keeping up with all the capacities there are, through technology is critical. And then, just not only relying on the numbers, but looking at the relationships and what's changing in stakeholders working together. That's really probably the most fundamental aspect of this work, and should be a focus of our attention. So the good news is that many, if not all, of these recommendations were heard by USAID, and they're represented in the refresh or the update of the youth and development policy. It was in draft form in the fall, and happy to report that there were a number of listening sessions where these ideas were brought to bear, and there is an objective number 3 in the new policy. It's not a new policy, but it's a refresh or update of the existing youth policy. But there is an objective 3 on building systems, and some of those activities that USAID is highlighting include mapping, getting better at mapping youth systems, convening, and really focusing on sustainability. So I think that policy is still in its approval phase, and hopefully will be coming out, this spring, who knows? So I think we're on a good track. But that's all I have for you right now. Maybe there's some questions, or Bonnie, you want to move on to the next phase? Not sure.
I mean, if someone has, I don't see any questions in the chat. If somebody wants to raise their hand, if you have a particular question right now for Claire about this, otherwise we're going to move on to another piece, and then we were going to come to discussion, but happy to stop right now if somebody has a question they'd like to ask. You can see your hand raised and unmute you. Okay. Don't see any right now, so we'll keep moving on. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So I wanted to just take a minute to go back to last year and try and connect this to a little bit to what Claire has presented by getting sort of like looking deeper within one country about one aspect of some systems change work that's going on. So Propante Mas is an effort in Honduras. It was a USAID supported project. And the focus, which always got me very excited, was about family systems counseling, family systems therapy. And the focus was on secondary prevention. It was not on primary prevention, but secondary prevention for young people who have already, maybe they've already entered a gang, there's some negative behavior that's been going on. So it's not just about preventing it before it happened, but knowing they're already involved. And what would need to happen to make sure that that doesn't get down to a tertiary level and we're involved with lots of different both financing issues as well as programming issues that are more expensive, more deep, and hopefully over time, we're not going to need those as much if we were doing this other work. So this focus was on trying to, how do you actually document change about what's going on in thinking about mental health care, and thinking about it not only for young people, but for their families, and realizing that young people who enter into more negative behaviors, that the initiating issues are not just themselves, but what's going on in their families and in their communities. So the focus was on this family systems therapy approach. And what they started to see in terms of making this change and thinking about the agreements, the redefinition, mainstreaming what was going on, the kinds of next level agreements that needed to happen, was about language. It was about recognizing really the family as a system. Thinking about expanding what intervention was, to think about how government entities looked at risk from and they started to use this risk differentiation. So it isn't just that it's all young people are this, or if you enter a gang, this is exactly who you are and everybody's exactly the same, but young people are at all different stages, from testing themselves out to getting more involved, to going in and coming out because they know that maybe it isn't really right, but they don't really have any options. So, and that gets into reducing the stigma of that, and just the whole recognition of youth as valuable inside the family and out. So there was a whole issue to think about, how is that being worked at the national level, and then with communities around the country, and obviously with family involvement. So we could go on to the next slide. So as a result of this, I think what the presentation when Robin Braverman did it last year, she wouldn't say that, oh, you're going to go to Honduras and you're going to see a totally reformed system. But there are things that have now become embedded, like this risk differentiation approach. There is new language. So when we're talking about the framework from the Youth Systems Collaborative and looking at things like, the mindsets, and how to think about the norms and what are we describing, that's begun to make a change. A system of the judiciary, of judges, of the legal system has begun to make we're seeing a decrease in the young people coming in to detention, because there are now options for them, because more mental health resources are being recognized and being funded and uplifted, so that there is more, not only knowledge of family systems, but more work going on. Again, has it changed? Is it available for everybody? Is it the way the system is fully yet? No, but there is the movement and the support from these different pieces of the system that are coming together to recognize how the change needs to happen. So there are new questions that are being asked to identify risk. There's risk assessment surveys, and that includes strengths. And part of this is the whole role of protective factors, and the language that is about risk and protective factors, protective and promotive factors. There's some different language that goes on. But the issue is to uplift the fact that we understand the protective factors from lots of research that's been going on over the last 10 to 15 years that young people need in their lives in order to make the right kind of decisions and go in a more positive direction. And we know that almost every young person, I would say not almost, every young person we meet along the way, no matter where, even if they are locked up in the most restrictive settings, when you begin to talk to them, everyone has strengths. Everyone has things to build on. And the whole positive youth development approach about identifying that and actually systematizing that as part of an assessment of young people is starting to happen. And now that also these families and counseling is being promoted at the municipal level through these collaborative committees, which Claire described, about different folks coming together, and service providers from other systems, from education, from health, who are coming together to think about young people who are involved in crime and violence in a different kind of way. So there's work going on. It is not, like we said, it is not the end. There's lots of work to do, but there's ways that we can continue to look at this, continue to learn from it, hopefully as it becomes more systemized and sustained, It's not going to be when a new president comes in or a new head of a a certain system, education, health, whatever, that they're going to be able to just change things, because things will be in place now in terms of language, measurements, mindsets, financing, that's moving and building on more of this effort from a positive youth development approach. So we wanted to now move on to, Mike was going to be, Mike, can I hand it over to you to see if there's any questions in the chat? And if not, Claire might have something. Go ahead.
We have just a comment to please go a little bit deep on the explanation about the abbreviation of your report, Bonnie. Maybe DINAF, INAMI, MIC, CSO.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question. And I'm going to tell you that I'm not I should have thought about that when we did the slide, and I would have asked Robin. I do not know, but I will find it out and we will get it back out to people. Thank you for the question. And it's also a reminder as we do these slides that we need to sort of have a little glossary to make sure we, define the full term. So we will get that back to you as soon as we can. Thank you.
Well, one you do know, Bonnie, which is the CSO was civil society organizations.
Oh, yes. That one, but I don't know the DINAF and the
right. And some of them are in Spanish as well.
Yeah.
Lindsay Halco is saying that these are organizations that work in Honduras with youth, DINAF and INAMI. So they are the names of the organizations in Honduras. Thank you, Lindsay. Very close here from Honduras. So.
Good.
Thank you, Lindsay.
So does it look like we have any other questions? Is it anybody want to raise their hand if you've got it off out of the cuff?
You can open your microphone or lift your hand if you have any question. We will be more than happy. Brooke Rosie Area said, are there any system thinking resources or training that you can refer us to if we want to increase our knowledge on this topic?
Claire, do you have anything?
Yes. That's, in reviewing a number of them, there's one that I like, the Omidyar Systems Thinking Guidebook, and it has, it's an entire training process that you can go through with a small team over probably a few months. And it has a very useful entire guidebook. So it's the Omidyar. And then the other that I'm involved in now that I really love, and I hope to be able to share it with you later on, is from the Presencing Institute, which is an institute out of MIT in Boston. And they have training in what they call awareness-based systems thinking. They have a version called ULab 1X, which is good for individuals who want to increase their systems thinking understanding. And then they have another pilot, another opportunity, which is called ULab 2X. And that is for teams of people who are all wanting to increase their understanding and awareness of systems and come together in collective action. And they periodically run 4 months, and they're free, which I love. 4-month sort of learning cycles where they go through this learning process. Individual teams go through this learning process with other teams around the world. So I'm in one right now, and there's 150 teams from around the world going through the process. So they're all doing very different things, but it's still using the same systems, tools, and methods. So I would recommend those.
Claire, some people that is there a link that you could put into the chat?
I'll do that.
Okay. Thank you.
find that and put that in there.
You know, I think what Claire is describing, you know, there's work, and probably many people on the call, I'm sure, are familiar with the term. There's a term called collective impact. There's a lot of work that's been going on in the US around this. And it's gone through very many variations over time. But the big point of it is that to get to the changes that we want to see, to reform the systems, to totally turn everything upside down, no one can do this by themselves. And so this whole issue of that, like we're trying to do through the Youth Systems Collaborative, of even coming together in a different kind of way, of different international organizations who aren't necessarily working together each day, but have found a space to come together to learn from each other and hopefully bring that back into their organizations, to help make further change in terms of the way that they respond to RFPs or, you know, requests for proposals or opportunities from donors, or bring some of this back to donors in a way that it isn't even individually that they're going back, but maybe groups of organizations like Save the Children and FHI 360 and Creative, you know, maybe joining forces to talk to donors in a different way about how the work, you know, could be done to have larger impact. One organization going in to do one project over 2 or 3 years is moving us in a direction to be able to have more evidence and build people's skills up and try and work, you know, certainly and strengthen and work with local localities to make that happen. But to get where we want to go, we have to do the work differently. So I think part of what even Claire was just describing about Systems U, and there's a link that was put in from Every Hour Counts, which is a domestic focus on out of school time, after school time, out of school time, but they've really spent a large majority of their work over the last few years has been looking at systems and how to change the whole out of school time system, which is made up of so many little organizations doing arts and sports and culture work and after school and, you know, homework help and so many different things. But how do you say that and build that up as a field and think about it? How is that system working? So in that report, there are actually some indicators and measures related to impacting the out of school time system in communities across the US. Some of that might be relatable in some other countries, may not be as much, but it's just another example of how another system's trying to do this work.
Bonnie?
Yes.
Bonnie, Jonah Jahaya has his hand raised.
Great, go.
Yes, hello, my name is Jonah Yahaya from Nigeria. And over the years, we have seen an increasing number of initiatives targeting young people, but obviously these initiatives haven't been so successful in addressing the many challenges that young people face, or even in reducing poverty amongst young people. And part of that reason is because we haven't really taken time to understand from young people's perspective what development looks like for them. And for me, I think the concept of systems thinking, especially youth systems thinking, it's fairly new in, let's say, in this part of the world, in Africa or in Nigeria specifically. And so my question here is, how can we embed systems thinking, youth systems thinking into government or into governance? I currently provide advisory services for a particular state government in Nigeria, and we are trying to use the SDGs as an entry point to mainstream youth initiatives into governance. How can we do so collaboratively, looking at the whole youth systems thinking? How do we embed that fully into governance in Nigeria? Thank you.
Claire, do you want to start or?
No, I was just tapping and I provided the three. This is an excellent question, but I've just provided 3 different sets of resources on systems thinking, training, and preparation. So maybe that's part of the answer to Jonah's question, but go ahead, Bonnie, on government.
Yeah. So I worked in local government for 8.5 years here in DC, and recognized the real difficulty of trying to bring a different way of thinking into that system, because things are very embedded in how people believe what the role of government is. And so I think is finding some, I would start with saying, are there some allies within government who you know, and who, and maybe they're from different parts, where you could bring them together and potentially share a little bit of, if you look through some of these documents, or we'd be happy to talk to you about this, to begin to have a conversation about what it is to move from thinking about just, the programs, but how do you sort of use the framework, that Youth Systems Collaborative framework, to begin to say what's going on in our health system, our education systems, our crime and violence prevention systems. But I think you have to start with some people who are willing to have a conversation, and they need to, and I wouldn't do it one by one. I would try and bring 2 or 3 people together and talk about, to share a document ahead of time that's not too, not too complicated, that sort of describes this move to saying, if we really want to get to the outcomes that we're looking for, like we said before, for millions and millions of young people in a country, how we have to begin to rethink what we're doing, and that and how do we raise up this work on changing systems and thinking about policy and financing and mindsets and data in new kinds of ways. So my basic answer is that I would start with a few people in government who you feel are ready to have the conversation, so that you can begin to talk about it.
I can also just share some, I worked in government for 12 years, actually at USAID, and there were some characteristics there, institutional, organizational characteristics that may be true for working in governments in other countries. One is that we were overworked, we were overwhelmed, and the information flow. What I loved about being there was I was privy to a lot of information coming from a lot of different places, and a lot of different people wanted to chime in. So that was interesting, but it also made it very difficult to step back and reflect on what we were doing, what I was doing, what we were doing. And so I think offering spaces for reflection, for stopping for one moment the frenetic activity and being able to reflect more deeply on what we're doing is really a critical first step. And the way we did this at USAID was we had a book club. I know it sounds pretty wonky, but that worked for us. So once a quarter, we would read a book together. And one of the book that we read was that was really launched a lot of our work was a classic in systems thinking. It was Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems. So that, for those who are looking for resources, that's a great place to start. And we read this book together, and there was no pressure for doing our work in this book club. It was really about the ideas that were sort of igniting our imagination about thinking and doing things in a different way. And so I think maybe, thinking in the Nigerian context, what are some spaces or ways that are culturally appropriate, that make sense for your context, for people to have that time to reflect together and think about doing things in a different way.
Great. I just put the link to that book in the chat. People like that. This is really hard work. This is not, like I said, we are going against the grain of how systems and governments have been set up to be very, whether you want to say in silos, categorical, linear, and to make the kinds of changes that we're talking about. We're talking this way. We're talking, how do you change everything to be more this, and not just to be at the top, but to go very deep. So to go deep and wide. And it's to reframe, it's almost like we have to think about colleges and universities and how people, you know, the curriculums in there about what are people learning about who are coming into these roles to be able to start to practice some of this, you know, when they're getting trained and being educated to come into a different systems that are working differently. So there's a lot of angles to this. So
sorry, because Claire mentioned kind of the coordination or how this is going to be reflective in the youth policy. Can you talk about the upcoming updated youth policy? Can you talk a little bit more about that, Claire, and how that kind of that intersection with systems and that youth policy?
Let's see. Well, the youth policy, the draft for the youth policy was shared in the fall. I don't know, maybe that's something you can reshare, Christy. But it has an entire piece on youth systems that's really mentions pretty much all the different dimensions that we've been talking about today. And it's not prescriptive, at least the way it's drafted now. It's the broad vision of multiple stakeholders coming together to actualize positive youth development. It talks about that, and then it sets out a series of sort of suggested activities that are important to this. You know, starting with mapping. So when we say mapping youth systems, how do the stakeholders in working together understand the youth system? So kind of to Jonah's question, how do you have, you know, multiple actors come together around, you know, a shared vision? And part of that involves understanding the system. And so there's a lot we could do a whole session just on mapping youth systems. You know, you can get as wonky as you want and, you know, with causal loop diagrammings, or you can get as interactive as you want using different kinds of art and mobilization of youth to map their own, the resources in their community. And then in terms of other dimensions that are mentioned, an important one is convening stakeholders and supporting the facilitation of multiple actors working together. And so that, I mean, and then I think the sustainability, seeing the sustainability and leveraging local resources. So this is of course going to connect well to USAID's sort of increased focus on local partners and having local partners be able to make the decisions around how funding is used and what the priorities are. So hopefully that answers a little bit of your question, Christy.
Yeah, no, thanks, Claire. Yep, that does. And thanks, Stephanie, for sharing the link again. I will take a look at it specifically with that in mind. So great, thank you.
Bunny and Claire, you have a question here in the chat. Frank says, what have you learned about the impact of partnering with public entities in this work? And after that answer, we're going to give the chance to Jonah again because he has raised his hand.
So, you know, to me, it's a lot of what we've been saying about finding some key allies, you know, who are sort of are sort of at least interested or on the same wavelength to be able to think about what's going on within their system. Again, health, education, workforce development, you know, whatever it may be, to find some allies to begin to connect with, even, you know, who are in the government. And they may not be the head of the department, they may be long-term staff, but they are committed and they can have impact and influence. And one of the other things is to remember that governments change. Who's in government and who's heading up ministries, mayors, presidents, they change. And so to really think about long-term, the impact that this work is going to be going on for a very long time, to think about really reframing, changing, evaluating financing these systems in new kinds of ways, is that you need to look at sort of who's coming up. So you can't ignore people who are out of power right now. They need to be allies in this process also, because they're going to eventually be the next mayor. They're going to be the next president. So thinking about, even in parliaments, who are you reaching out to begin to have discussions and share what we're learning globally about the importance of changing systems, is not just the people who are in power, but those who surround them and who are out, who may be in. Again, it's thinking very long term. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes. So Jonah.
Yes, just a follow-up question. So just to share a bit of context, when we started working around youth inclusion, we came up with an innovation that maps and sources innovation from young people that addresses many socioeconomic challenges that they are facing in their communities. Now, what we did was to build a partnership with state governments to be able to incorporate those innovations after being tested and certified that they're going to yield the desired results. We incorporated those innovations into government systems in a way of funding innovations across the various MDAs. The challenge here still remains that young people are not seen as part of the process. Okay. Most of the time we are seen as though young people are inexperienced, and so there's hardly any buy-in when it comes to fully incorporating youth initiatives in government system. It's a huge challenge for us, and one way to mitigate that for us was to partner with international organizations, for example, like USAID, for example. If there was an initiative that USAID is bringing that addresses some of these issues, it will be more accepted because it's coming from, a well-informed perspective or from a well-recognized organization, as opposed to say young people just saying, we have this innovation and we want to put it through the government system. It's about gaining acceptance when we are talking about youth issues. And I think that's the big challenge for us.
Jonah, I think this is just such an important thing you've raised. And this is going to move us into, we have to start, and we see there's another point about strategic planning and methods that youths in developed countries can follow and be a part of these. I'm thinking, Mike, this is sort of off the cuff, but we don't have to be doing sort of webinars every month where we bring in people from the outside. Jonah, we'd maybe like to talk to you and a couple of other people about our April time together, and see if we want to focus on this particular issue with some young people like you who are engaged in this. We could even do some breakouts, and maybe you could get some more of your colleagues to join in to that call. But I mean, this is such a critical part of the whole systems change process, is voice, and whose voices are we listening to, and who's a part of the whole process of every aspect of the framework. Claire, go ahead.
Exactly. I think you really hit it on the head, Jonah. When I mentioned that there is significant work in mindset shift, and one of the key ones is seeing young people as actors who have every right and every ability to contribute to policy and programs and decision making. And so that mindset shift has been a main focus for USAID's funded work. And in listening to how that's happening in different countries, I've been told that it takes a period of time, it takes investment, and one of the first steps that our partners have said have been the most effective is providing positive youth development training to the adults in the public systems that are intended to be benefiting youth, but working with those adults and having the youth play active roles with them. So I think the investment in that training and understanding that this is a mindset shift, and it's going to take time and effort, that's really important.
So Claire, I know we're running out of time.
Yeah, we are.
We are, YP2LE and Sarah specifically, who's on this call, is working with another USAID partner, YouthXL, on some training. that engages adults and specifically USAID staff members. And so maybe we can share that at a difference. It's in development now, but I would ask that we can you know, share that as the time, you know, comes when it comes to that time. So the training set could happen in June. So it's thank you, Rachel's on here too. So great. So yeah, thanks for that. I just wanted to add that we absolutely agree with what you're saying, Claire. Over to you, Bonnie. Sorry.
That's all right. No, that's great.
I was going to mention that too, because Rachel works with Youth Excel here also in Central America. So it would be a great help too.
Well, we may want to talk to you and Jonah and a couple others about next week's. I'm sorry, we're going to have to go. If you have a question, Binyam, if you want to put it in the chat, but it's 10 o'clock and we have to get off, and we have one last slide we need to get through, and about Mike, it's about joining YouthPower. That's the way to do it. Hope you will.
Yes, we're gonna be sharing on the website youthpower.org. Please register on youthpower.org and then connect with us in the YSS COP. We welcome you anytime you want, and please sign. You're gonna get some events in the future, Bonnie.
Yes, so we'll send out the slides. You're going to be getting all of this. We're going to look to do probably in May one about system strengthening youth peace and security with Search for Common Ground. But when we do the thing in April, we want to talk to some of the folks who are on today about what we could do just with our community of practice to get down deeper into those issues related to young people's roles. And then there are these other couple of things that are coming up on April 20th and April 21st. And we so appreciate everybody being here. Please send any suggestions or comments. We're happy to listen, and we want to hear less of us and more from you next time. So that's the way it will be organized. So we'll be in touch. Mike, anything else?
We appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.